it will set a precedent in terms of what the government is allowed to, how the level of coercion that is considered acceptable by the government regarding big tech and the speech of people using those platforms. And I would presume any other platform that the government would like to kind of approach and say, you better take this down.
Is this the most important legal case for free speech in modern history? Today we're talking about Murphy versus Missouri. It's the case of the decade, potentially, alongside other cases like what we're seeing with Julian Assange here in the UK, really around the fight for free speech. Now, Andrew's a previous guest. He's been with us on a prior episode where we talked about the Westminster Declaration, which was really all about this and how we can protect our free speech. And this is a seminal case. So we brought Andrew back on. He's been at the courtroom this week. We want to hear directly about why this case is important, why we need to pay attention, and what's been going on and what the prognosis is for the result. So Andrew, great to have you back, and really excited to be talking about this important case with you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And now, is it hyperbole to say this is the most important legal case? It certainly is prominent. It certainly is important. What's your assessment of this case and why it's so important?
Well, I mean, it's certainly important. It got all the way to the US Supreme Court, and I think that's you don't get all that way if something isn't going on, or at least there's a strong case one way or the other. But I mean, I see this in some ways as, you know, the Twitter files kind of legal case. A lot of the same things that were talked about in the Twitter files in terms of the entanglement between big tech and kind of multiple arms of government is essentially the case that the plaintiffs are making, that the government worked with and at times directed big tech to censor content, specifically, or it focuses here a little bit more around the COVID aspect, because all of the plaintiffs have an angle there, but two are quite prominent in that regard. So one being Jay Bhattacharya, the Great Barrington Declaration, another one being Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, who's a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, Irvine, or was until he was removed for refusing to adhere to the university's vaccine mandate. He was also a professor of ethics. He saw those mandates essentially as fundamentally unethical. So those people, along with two other plaintiffs, a man called Jim Hoff and a woman called Jill Hines, along with the states of Missouri and Louisiana, hence Murphy versus Missouri, previously Missouri versus Biden, brought the case through various other courts, and then now through appeal from through the US government to the Supreme Court. So I sat in there in DC on Monday to hear the case, also because it really was quite a gathering of free speech advocates, mostly from around the US, but I felt it was worthy enough for myself to fly in directly. And, you know, it was, if people have followed some of the other conversations, it was a bit of a mixed bag. It wasn't the knockout punch that I think a lot of people were hoping for in terms of at least the oral argument that was given, but the written arguments are certainly very, very strong. So by the end of June, apparently we will know where this ruling will land.
Okay, so I'd like to explore some of that in more detail in a moment in terms of the arguments that are made. But what are the implications of this case? So, you know, what is the kind of success-failure outcome of this particular case?
Right. So this is actually a case just at the moment about the injunction, because some of the lower courts essentially put in an injunction that said that, you know, these various agencies, FBI, CISA, White House, etc., cannot contact social media companies regarding issues of First Amendment protected speech. So first, the hearing is actually on that question of, can the injunction stand? So this is what the Supreme Court was just hearing. And either way, if the Supreme Court says yes or no, there's still a case that is to be heard around the question of, did the government censor these the plaintiffs that have brought the case, which of course includes those states acting on behalf of their their citizens. But essentially, if the injunction is what is actually temporarily stayed, much of it, but if it is completely lifted, or it is the stays is stayed, we should say, then essentially allows the White House and the FBI and all the various government agencies to be essentially coercing big tech platforms to censor First Amendment protected speech, as they were doing all throughout COVID, as they've been doing around the Ukraine war, around all manner of different things. So it sets a precedent. I mean, my background is not legal, but my understanding is it will set a precedent in terms of what the government is allowed to, how the level of coercion that is considered acceptable by the government regarding big tech and the speech of people using those platforms. And I would presume any other platform that the government would like to kind of approach and say, you better take this this down.
So is one of the
That's very important in that sense, because it green lights these relationships to say, actually, it's okay that the government is leaning on these technology companies.
Oh, I mean, that to me is one of the most dangerous precedents that this could set. So is one of the primary accusations that the government is violating its First Amendment principles? Is that a direct accusation that's being made?
Yes, that is exactly the accusation.
And how are the representatives of the US government defending that violation? Are they legitimizing it and saying that there's an exception because
they're essentially saying they're not coercing, they're just advising, they're using their bully pulpit in their words to recommend, make suggestions, strong suggestions often that, this should be, this content is appropriate. A lot of this came out also of in mid-July of 2021 when Joe Biden said social media companies are killing people. There was really quite a campaign that the US government went on, particularly around COVID, to push the companies very, very hard. And there's a lot of emails from Discovery, some from the Twitter files, that really show how much they were pushing the big tech companies to remove often very, very specific people like RFK Jr., but also really to push big tech companies, by essentially suggesting they're killing people, to crack down on what they consider misinformation, which essentially was things that went against government policy, much of which, as I'm sure your listeners and watchers know, turned out to be incorrect. So, what this also ends up being is, you cannot question government edicts, right? People who did during the COVID panic got censored. And this essentially will legitimize further censorship around all manner of different issues.
Yeah, I mean, we're facing very similar issues here in the UK, and it hasn't reached a point of legal challenge yet, which is something I'm concerned about, but also interested in exploring. I myself have experienced vast censorship across all platforms, and it was coordinated. It must have been coordinated because it would happen concurrently across platforms. It's highly improbable that each individual platform made the concise decision simultaneously to do this. And I'm still struggling on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and I think I was caught up in that. We've got other representatives here in the UK who are now doing freedom of information requests to look at the MI5 and MI6 involvement. So we can see this has clearly happened. But your point here around strong recommendation, at what point does strong recommendation, from the way you've described it, at what point does strong recommendation become coercion? Because the same has been true around.
Well, this was where the kind of weeds of the discussion or the hearing really centered, was one of certainly the main points, where the government was essentially trying to argue that they're not coercing, they're just suggesting, even though there's emails that say, I'm talking to the very highest, and I mean the very highest levels of the White House, references to Section 230, which is one of the laws or frameworks, essentially means social media is considered not a publisher, and kind of absolves them of responsibility for certain types or amounts of the content that is on their platforms. But you also see emails, say, from Nick Clegg, where he's talking, he's responding to White House communications saying, they've amended their terms of service, and also expressing in other emails regret for having taken down content at the behest of the government. So, I mean, from my perspective, the coercion is absolutely clear. from the justice's perspective, it seemed to be some were convinced and some were middling. But then there was also this completely outside the Overton window case where Justice Jackson actually was saying the First Amendment, hamstrings was her word, the government, because she gave this ridiculous argument, what if there's an epidemic of children jumping out of windows at increasing heights? The government should be able to intervene to make social media companies not distribute that content because of questions around safety and etc. I mean, but I can't this kind of fanciful idea that somehow children are going to suddenly just be jumping out of windows because there's a social media fad seemed rather ridiculous and extreme. But that was kind of where she was at. She was actually essentially saying the First Amendment hamstrings the government is a problem more generally. At least the other eight were staying within the framework of the Constitution, which I presume, not being an expert in U.S. law, that when you raise your right hand and say, I swear to defend the Constitution, you are also swearing to defend the First Amendment. She certainly admitted to the First Amendment at all.
Well, so there's a lot here to explore, because there's a variety of things here that you've said that are important to look at. So, I mean, most of us have probably heard of a story where there is an exceptional case where someone on TikTok or some other platform has done something irresponsible and may have lost their life, and that's tragic. Like, I've definitely heard stories of that nature in the last month, very very recently, in fact. So those things do happen. However, it's the classic case of the few spoil it for everyone, and as a result, when an exception becomes a rule, we're on dangerous territory, and when even more dangerous territory when we take this big brother safetyism approach. We're here to protect you; it's for your safety.
Absolutely.
And then we give that authority. We take away further responsibility from the individual and their own actions. If an adult or a child makes a decision that is fundamentally endangering their life. Now, granted, if you're a minor, that your life experience may give you less faculties to make such decisions. But again, where is the parental responsibility lie before the state enters the home to make such decisions? So there's that dynamic of the conversation, which I think is important. And under this culture, we're increasingly seeing this safetyism culture to justify the imposition of further government mandates or powers such as this. But what concerns me, Andrew, related to that point, is this becomes a cultural shift that permeates lawmakers, judges, and as a result, becomes a mindset that could actually influence a decision like this, which is to me, it's a worrying trend, which leans towards this techno authoritarianism.
Absolutely. I mean, and that was in some ways the most concerning thing for me, was the kind of cultural drift that some of the justices seem to be caught up in, that is even more fundamental than the legal ones. Of what are the kind of social societal norms around this, and the acceptance of this authoritarian paternalistic state that many people seem to crave today. That you probably need to get a psychiatrist and a sociologist on to unpack and understand, like, what is this new craving for this paternalistic state that is going to keep you safe. We saw it all throughout COVID. People seem very reluctant to want to make their own decisions. I mean, not everyone, but like a significant swathe of people seem to be very, very inclined towards asking for or demanding state authority. And I think that in some ways was where the division, perhaps one of the most salient divisions amongst the justices, lay, was that there are some who essentially see the public good served by more state power and authority, and there are others that saw the public good served by less state power and authority. And it's not really a left-right question. It's like, do you think more government and more authority from government and more paternalism and more safetyism is going to get you somewhere better as a rule generally across society, or do you think actually that is part of the problem? Of course, there are also all manner of different conflicted interests in that, because some people benefit, even if they don't necessarily believe that, but benefit from one ideology or the other as well. But that seems to be a huge dividing line. And whereas significant sections of kind of the left progressive spectrum used to be extremely skeptical of government authority and see it as a major source of ills, now that culture has predominantly switched to the other side. Even most bizarrely, looking from afar at the UK, when it's the Tories, all this, we hate the Tories, etc. But then when COVID comes around and other things come around, it's like, oh, actually, but we really like it when the Tories take more power and have more authority to protect us. And I was like, I'm sure everyone's confused, but it is pretty, for very good reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a behavioral scientist coming on soon to talk about why people detach from their own personal values during this time, which I think is an important clue in the cultural swing, as well as the political swing. I suppose it does raise an argument of around where the boundaries of free speech lie and whose responsibility it is to look at those boundaries. And I think this is partly where it's been utilized, because in the New York Times, in an article just this week or last week, there was an argument that free speech is eroding democracy. And that bemuses me, because to me, democracy requires full information. And if you're cutting off a supply of information and skewing it in one particular direction, because let's face it, you mentioned a kind of progressive type side of the political spectrum. We've looked at the biases within these fact-checking organizations, and they're heavily left/progressive leaning. Now, I don't want to make this a partisan conversation, but if the tide is swinging one way and it's in your favor that censorship prevails, you have to be very careful, because when that pendulum swings the other way, and we see this every day, people are arguing for free speech when it suits them, when it matches their own personal agendas or ideologies. But when it doesn't, censorship is the rule of the day. So that there is this broader context that I think is playing out. But I don't know how does this play out in the court?
Well, it actually shouldn't in some ways, because it's just First Amendment protected speech. And so if it's not illegal speech, then it's allowed. And my understanding is that even false speech is First Amendment protected, because people say false things knowingly or unknowingly all the time. So if you were going to pick up every politician for every lie they made, I mean, all of the, House of Commons would probably be in jail. Right, so
some would say that's a good thing.
So you have to have that could be a good thing. But again, as a free speech advocate, I'm not going to pursue that line. But you have to give leeway, so it's kind of cost benefit. But again, this is not a kind of cultural war question. This is a legal question, and in terms of these arguments, it's like, is this First Amendment protected speech? It is. And so therefore, why is the government getting involved in it? It's getting involved in it because it's trying to tip the scales in its favor around certain narratives, whether they're lockdowns or masks or vaccines or Ukraine war or whatever it might be. And it's incredibly dangerous. And I don't know what the secret is to try, and as much as I'm trying to reach the kind of liberal left progressive world, which I have spent 20 plus years in, to suggest to them this is a really bad idea. Even if it's the Tories doing it and it won't kind of like reach them, then I'm really sometimes beside myself in terms of what actually will.
Yeah, it's very.
But I mean, the UK situation, I imagine, is quite different. I don't know what the level of speech protection is that you have there either.
Well, we're on an equally slippery slope. I mean, the First Amendment is very clearly documented as a tool to prevent, or theoretically prevent, governments from intervening. I'm not sure the same protocols here are quite so prominent, but there will be some level of protection, and we'll perhaps speak to some UK legal professionals to understand where that land lies in our side of the pond, because it's important. It's important that we understand that and protect that, because this has been a global challenge. It's not limited to the United Kingdom. We know that the pandemic has created a gross skew of information. And what's damning about this, and it links to one of the recent episodes we covered where we looked at the Article 4 in France, which actually potentially criminalizes medical debate because
Mm-hmm.
and the consequences of that are severe, because what it does is it puts the knowledge authority, as well as the moral authority, you could argue, into the hands of the state to be the arbiter of what information is reliable, trustworthy sources. And that's essentially what's happened during
Mm-hmm.
COVID, is that several groups, government actors, and related agencies and intergovernmental agencies such as the World Health Organization have taken it upon themselves to assume uh, authority over information. And as such, they've wielded the First Amendment in the American case to defend their position. And we know, looking back at a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the things that they censored have well, at the time were still correct, and to this day now have been validated. But at the time, when you start
Mm-hmm.
to censor and smear things, people are then unable to take that full information and fully understand the situation. And if the government has the power to do that again, then we're on a very slippery slope. Whether it's COVID or a pandemic or environmental issues or any other spectrum of ideas, and I think that's possibly why on the political
Mm-hmm.
spectrum, Andrew, that we have a problem, because again, where the tide flows, with particularly around environment,
Mm-hmm.
people want censorship for the environmental discussion because it supports a certain narrative or a set of ideas, and
Yeah.
and that's where it becomes
Mm-hmm.
really tricky. But as you said, that shouldn't be a factor. It's a simple: can the government intervene with big tech or any other large business or small business? It doesn't matter how big you are, to say you can and cannot do this. I mean, that is a very simple set of arguments. Yet that's at risk. That's what we face. If the First Amendment,
Well, it's not at risk. It has
it's
it
already been
it
violated.
we're already
It's already
there.
been violated.
We're
So
already there. And so it's a question of how many of the escape routes are being kind of shut down, as we try and weave our way, out back into into the free world. I mean, you have this Scottish law coming in just a week or two, right? The hate speech bill that they have, or law there, that criminalizes speech inside your own home. I mean, this is bizarre. This is insane. How is this even possible that it can go private speech? You're not even broadcasting your opinion. You're inside your home having a conversation about whatever you might like to say. And this is also part of my argument. It's like, well, if you want to, advocate for a position that the moon is made of cheese, then actually, fine. You can go around saying you think the moon is made of cheese. I think most people are smart enough to not listen um, to you, and that good arguments, good speech is generally going to win. There is a cost. It's not like there is zero cost to free speech. There is, but the cost of not having free speech is far, far higher in terms of essentially having tyrannical government that appoints itself arbiter of the truth. I mean, these are the things we all learn. This is why 1984 is taught in school, and then sometimes it's a bit fat little good. That seems
well,
to
I'm not even sure it is being
have
taught in
done.
school. It's probably on the list of banned books now. It's probably been censored. It's probably been.
It might. It probably. Yeah, it's interesting to know. So yeah, we're already there. So the question is, how are we going to get out of this mess that, I mean, it's not as bad as I think as 2021, 22 is, but now there's huge number across the world, not just in the US, but, in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, as you mentioned, in Australia, they have this new misinformation bill that they're trying to push through. I mean, it's a kind of global coordinated elite movement for censorship that is done under the guise of malinformation, and what they define as hate speech. And I mean, I think there are certain victories that are coming along. I think actually the fact that the Irish Prime Minister just stepped down. I mean, it's not directly related, but the kind of Irish population seems to be increasingly rejecting a lot of these ideas. So it's not like there's no pushback. And again, the fact that this case, the Murphy versus Missouri case, got all the way to the Supreme Court tells you there is definitely a counter movement. on the tech platforms. There are obviously lots of alternative platforms. We had a brief window or a brief breath of fresh air from Mr. Musk before that kind of has gone all topsy-turvy again, and doesn't seem to be living up to anywhere near the expectations of most people. And if it is living up to your expectations, then I would definitely be having a little bit more of a questioning, have more questioning why you think that is. I mean, Substack. You post a Substack link on Twitter, and it is throttled. You cannot get people to your
It's a
Substack
total waste of time me posting
via
anything
Twitter.
on Twitter right now. I mean, I haven't got a huge account, 25,000 followers on there. During the height of COVID, the
Yeah,
minimum amount of shares I would get on any post prior to being banned was, and it wasn't even directly banned; it's shadow banned. It's minimum
yeah,
5,000
yeah.
shares. Each post would reach millions of people, and now I'll be lucky if I get 4 to 5 shares or even 4 to 5 views. It's I just can't break through that. And I pay for premium. I mean, tomorrow morning is a bit of fun. I'm gonna take a photo of me and my middle finger's up, saying "screw you." I'm not paying to have my account suppressed, and I'm one of many who have been
Oh yeah,
slapped.
no, no. There's
There's
many
so many
people.
of us. But
Yeah,
as with all big
no,
tech,
no. I
you
think
can't reach anyone.
there is censorship on it.
I
Absolutely.
can't talk to anyone about
Yeah,
it.
there's
You know,
100% censorship on it.
I can tag Elon every day, but I'm
Yeah,
playing. It's like, Daddy, let me out of my room now. No, I don't want to play
yeah.
that game.
I mean
It's the same thing.
the solution is not. Yeah, the solution is definitely on the technical plane. Waiting around for big tech oligarchs is definitely not what is what is going to provide the solution.
So coming back to the court, Andrew, what are some of the other arguments that were made in favour of defending the First Amendment? It's such an important piece of defence. What stood out for you in terms of the critical arguments that were made, either from what you've got from the written or the notes in court.
Mm. Well, I mean, the critical argument essentially is this. There are explicit emails from the White House, um, essentially saying, take this down. They're not kind of fudging around in terms of what they say. So, particularly with Twitter, so there's one particular case around RFK. RFK is not a plaintiff, but he does also have another separate case as well, because one of the things that went down in the weeds a little bit was this question of standing. So do all of the plaintiffs have standing because, for example, Jay Bhattacharya and Aaron Kheriaty, there's no specific, whilst they were both censored on social media platforms in the case, there's no explicit evidence of where government officials censored them. But on two of the others, there is. And also, Louisiana and Missouri are essentially claiming that more broadly their citizens were impacted. But they wanted some of the justices wanted a very, very clear link between, the White House took this thing down. So, I mean, that is also a problem for the case. The White House asked the social media to take this explicit thing down, which there are other examples of, but they're not always related to all of the plaintiffs. So it may get kind of caught up around this question of standing. So there's a certain amount of arguments that were happening saying, that there is standing for my clients, et cetera, for the plaintiffs because of X, Y, and Z. And I think from what I observed and read, there is enough there. The other one is essentially around this question of coercion and significant encouragement. And I think you have to ask someone with a kind of more legal background there, because my understanding was that significant encouragement already, met the standard, and it's absolutely undeniable if you read some of the correspondence that there is significant encouragement vis-a-vis the government saying, we recommend, we suggest, we want you to take these people off the internet or take their content down. But again, there was a question of, is it coercion versus significant encouragement? And then, of course, you had Justice Jackson going all the way of, actually, I think coercion is good. Government coercion of speech to protect safety, children jumping out of windows, is actually where we should we should be. We don't want the government hamstrung. At the same time, one of the problems was that the plaintiff's case was hamstrung by the fact that they had a very new and young lawyer, which has to do apparently with some politicking. I'm not sure if it's in Missouri or in Louisiana, and the actual lead lawyer was not able to argue the case. And it's a man named John Sauer, who was incredibly convincing, and I think we would be in a much more confident position had he been there. At the same time, the oral arguments aren't the be all and end all. There are, hundreds of pages of evidence that have been submitted, much of which I have read. I mean, maybe also some of the different things that are named in here, the kind of coordination that happen are things like the election integrity partnership, which we spoke about once as well, and something called the Virality Project. So the Election Integrity Partnership was an initiative that was led by the Stanford Internet Observatory by a woman called Renee DiResta, who was introduced by her boss, Alex Stamos, as having worked for the CIA. That is a quote. So she led this thing called the Election Integrity Partnership, which some discovery from this thing called House Committee on Weaponization of the Federal Government discovered an email to one of the partners, something called the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is a sub-project of the Atlantic Council, that there's an email to a guy called Graham Brookie, who leads that initiative, that says, we were just asked to set up, this is a kind of summary quote, to set up a election integrity partnership at the behest of the Department of Homeland Security and CISA. So that election integrity partnership became later, after the election, something called the Virality Project, which specifically was focused on so-called anti-vaccine misinformation, and has this kind of infamous quote where they, which was discovered through the Twitter files, that they were telling their social media platforms that true stories of vaccine side effects should be considered misinformation. So the piece that I recently put out just before the Supreme Court hearing was essentially looking at the people that the Virality Project had flagged to social media companies that seemed to have very legitimate claims of vaccine injury. One was a girl named Maddie DeGarry, who was in the Pfizer trial, and they kind of documented all manner of evidence around her, and they essentially told the big tech platforms that her story was false because of timing around the Moderna trial. So she was in the Pfizer trial. So even this documentation that they put into this kind of content flagging system said on it, as I went through it and saw it, because these documents were released by this House Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, they've logged these documents of Pfizer, she's in the Pfizer trial. Then they say, false, she was in the Moderna trial. The dates don't line up. So this is, a lot of this is so deeply pernicious for a variety of reasons, but also these people are completely incompetent as well. So on one level, they're wrong a lot of the time about their claims. And this is unfortunately one thing that didn't come up so much in the hearing, is that throughout it was kind of assumed that the government actually did have a kind of extremely solid grasp on the truth, or perhaps the most authoritative claim on the truth. Whereas again, we saw during the pandemic that they got a million things wrong. And I would say even if they got 9 out of 10 things right, you need that citizen participation in the conversation, because you don't know the next time either way. So if someone is listening who's like, oh, well, actually the government got it pretty right on this, well, I'm sure you can think of other times that the government has got it pretty wrong. That's why there are Senate inquiries or royal commissions or various investigations, because the government frequently gets it wrong. And the citizenry are there to check the government, and the First Amendment and other free speech legislation is also there to check the government, to prevent us from going back into, being ruled by aristocrats.
I mean, what it creates is a false perception of reality. When the government is able to censor information that contravenes its own view on the world, then the citizenry will believe that the government is right because there's no contradictions, because they're all being shut down and smeared and turned around. And my surprise at this point
Yep.
in 2024 is that there are still people who believe that what went on during COVID is the right thing to do and is entirely legitimate. Now, as a result,
Right.
we've had so much of these Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kordoff and hundreds and thousands.
So I should have had Martin Kulldorff is one of the other plaintiffs.
Yeah, and who's
Okay,
recently lost his position at Harvard too. And it's such a broad problem, and if it's not stopped in its tracks here, then everything we move forward. And the fact that you mentioned the vaccine, so there's a couple of issues there. This is a parallel problem because whether it was vaccine mandates, whether it was lockdowns, whether it was schools shutting down, the government are now backtracking to say it was only ever guidance, strong recommendations. The same argument is being applied across multiple modalities, in which case, leading people to believe that things are illegal if they're only actually guidance, to me is again a gross injustice.
Yep.
And the same approach. So this is where that line, and many people voluntarily took the vaccines and the interventions on the basis that they were compelled to believe that it was essential. And as a result, that's to me, again, it's very coercive in the way that was delivered. You can actually download behavioral science reports and looking at the language that they were used to manipulate people to believe that they've only got certain choices. And that to me is, again, another form of coercion. Now, the second problem here, Andrew, is that when manufacturers of products like Pfizer, etc., are able to form partnerships with governments, public-private partnerships, that problem of the state bleeds into the private sector, whereby, where those partnerships exist, the government effectively create protection for those institutions. And looking back at the pandemic, there was no indemnities against these organizations. So in a way, they become a protected class, not just at government level, but within the private sector and the NGOs and all the other organizations that collaborate to form this wider big state. And that to me is, this is enabling that. There is no resistance to that when you censor information and when you voluntarily allow things like the First Amendment, which is designed to protect against those things, to be trodden upon. So this to me is a much, much broader problem. Now, so you mentioned at the beginning there's a date for the verdict. When is the verdict due for this case?
I think there's a date. It's just my understanding is it should be by June 30th. But just to quickly go back to what you were saying, I mean, ultimately what has been broken is informed consent.
Absolutely.
Because people didn't get all the information that they required to make a good, an informed decision about what was best for them. So you have a huge number of kind of norms that are essentially being overturned down to, what you can and cannot do with, or should or shouldn't do with your body. So it's very serious, and I think this kind of corporatism, of this kind of fusion of kind of business and the state is absolutely 100% part of that. And essentially, what a lot of these fact checkers and mis and disinformation flaggers and researchers were doing was ultimately were protecting these corporations from the scrutiny that they deserved, along with protecting the government from the scrutiny that they also merited. So, and so, when I mentioned also the virality project, I mean, they were explicitly, to my mind, an initiative to break informed consent, to hide true stories, even of someone being vaccine injured. So you couldn't take that into account and going, okay, maybe it is actually not that many people that get vaccine injured. I think it's actually probably a lot more than we're hearing. But then the government needs to come out and say, well, yes, there are some risks and there are some benefits, and here's all the evidence that says why you should still do it, and factor that in. And so we have this whole new modality of governance, which is basically extremely authoritarian. And again, the surprise for so many of us has been, why have all my so-called anti-authoritarian friends decided that actually they really like a bit of authoritarianism? Now, what is that switch? I mean, probably the Stanford prison experiment explains a lot of that to us. That people really can turn on a dime and abandon values that they held very, very quickly. It's a surprise that I'm sure we're all, or many people are digesting.
And it's, to me, it's the hijacking of the greater good. You know, it's this moral authority and being wanting to associate with doing the right thing and being a good person and doing things for the greater good, and therefore having the
Mm-hmm.
willingness to turn a blind eye to other evils. And authoritarianism and tyranny are some of those things that people have turned a blind eye to because it suits their agenda. But now, again, I've seen many people as victims of that. You know, it's how can you function appropriately as a society when you have a lack of full information, when information is being censored?
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of the wider issue here, is that, you know, they're talking about the election. You know, this is a pivotal year for elections. 49% of the world's population is going through an electoral cycle this year. If the governments and their
Mm-hmm.
agencies are free during this time to censor information they believe to be malinformation, misinformation, or whatever form of, you know, disinformation, whatever term they want to use, then you're skewing electoral results. So when you've
Yep.
got the New York Times arguing that free speech is a threat to democracy, on the contrary, democracy requires full information. Otherwise, you're literally being manipulated to vote in a certain way. And we already
Yep.
know the tools are out there. We know that it's been shown and proven that social media can actually change people's political leanings. We've already seen during COVID, for the things that you've outlined, that people violate their own personal values
Mm-hmm.
under certain circumstances. And
Yep.
this is something that's now normalized, moralized, but now going to be legally viable if we're not careful. So this is why, to me, in
Yep.
answer to that
But there was also a
that big question, is this the most
Mhm.
important legal case? It's certainly one of them on that basis, because this is opening the door to all of those things.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah. I mean, there was also I think, no, you're right. A Globe and Mail, I think, Canadian newspaper article that I haven't read yet, but was doing the rounds around also essentially saying, you know, too much free speech is bad for democracy. And there's another piece which is going around, which is, you know, I think something along the lines of, you know, why the deep state is awesome, which is a new piece by the New York Times as well. So one of the things that is interesting is that
Literally scrambles my
in some
brain
ways they're
hearing
laying it
that.
on the table.
Yeah.
They're like, they're laying it on the table and saying, well, actually, you're not going to try and pretend that there was no censorship or etc. We're actually going to say, actually, we've just decided we don't really like free speech anymore, and we're going to say that the national security state is really not, is actually really, really great. I think they use the word heroes in the introduction to this New York Times piece about why the deep state is awesome. So in some ways, it's interesting because the fact that they've had to fall back, they have had to
The
fall
collective
back to
they,
this kind of
yeah.
position tells you something about where they're at, because I think it starts to become otherwise untenable to the censorship is becoming increasingly obvious to a lot of people. And so you can't make the argument now on was free speech restricted or not. They're also kind of acknowledging that it is. And the New York Times and Justice Jackson, etc., is just saying, well, but maybe it's not so bad. Actually, maybe this is a good thing for society. So that is something that absolutely needs to be 100%
Well, that's
resisted.
again the
Well,
cultural piece.
along with everything else that we've already talked about.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just pulled up,
Yes, it is.
a photo from Houston Airport. So I spoke at a conference in Morelia in Mexico earlier this year around our freedoms and defending and advancing our freedoms in many ways, but also looking at broader systemic change. And as I was flying through my connecting flights into Houston, you may not be able to see this photo, but it says protecting our nation one face at a time. Biometric facial comparison for a more fast and secure service. So we want to recognize your we want to identify you with this surveillance system because it's for your safety. We're going to protect our nation with this surveillance
Yeah.
system.
Well, I know you get on a flight now. You get on a flight now from the US. I was quite taken aback and shocked the other day. Kind of was pulling out my boarding pass, and they basically just whipped out a camera and took a shot of my face without me being ready for it. And my boarding pass was my face.
Well, consent doesn't
And I
matter
must
anymore,
say, I did
clearly.
not like
Yeah,
that.
consent doesn't matter. It's all.
Well, I mean, and then it's a bit like, what do? You say no. Well, I didn't. I mean, I was already done by that stage. But I mean, next time I will be ready to say no and say no. Please take my please take my paper boarding
Yeah,
pass.
I think there was like
But
a
yeah, all these norms are being
yeah,
eviscerated.
there was like an asterisk. If you don't consent to this, you can go and do this, or do this other process that's going to take you 2 hours to manually get checked through this thing. You can, like, so people always will go. Unfortunately, it's a cultural issue. People want speed, convenience, ease, safety, security, and so in many ways, what I worry about as a legal, we've touched on it, but I worry about a legal case in the context of the social cultural soup that we're in means that there is actually more
Mm,
likelihood that the government will be able to continue to advance in their aims and their wider agencies. I mean,
yeah.
there's a UN meeting in September in New York this year, which is kind of looking to create this pact for the future. It's to advance global cooperation and double down on some of their
Hmm.
key agendas. And as a result of that, I'm deeply concerned because that, to me, is going to be where they start to normalize we're okay to censor in the interest of national security. We're
Yeah.
okay to censor
Yeah.
in safety. And you start to get an enormous amount of power concentrated around this idea that they claim and then weaponize. That weaponization report is right on because weaponizing against the public who have become increasingly dumbed down and
Hmm.
weak and less resilient. Let's face it, we're not, I grew up in an age, Andrew, and I don't know if you had this, there was the phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Now it's like words are so dangerous, we need harms bills in order to, like, in your private home, if someone says that offends you, I could say, I don't like the look of those, I preferred your previous hairstyle, Andrew, and you could be totally offended, get me arrested. Someone could be right at the door. I'm only kidding. You look wonderful as always, but very stylish gentleman. But that's my point. Anything could subjectively be construed as harmful,
Yeah. No, totally.
and this is
But the positive spin that I will give to you is that I don't think you do these things when you're in control,
that's right.
where you naturally have the people or kind of the majority behind
Yes,
you. I think you do this when you're quite threatened,
yes,
when your kind of ideas are weak, when you struggle to convince the population, then you revert to these tools. So the upside, if there is one, and we have to find silver linings because I think there are deep cracks in this system, is that they're doing this out of a certain amount of desperation. Some of it might just be power grabbing, but I think a lot of it is, they cannot. Uh, their ideas are they're bad ideas. They get things wrong a lot of the time. They don't want people to know it. They will lose in a full kind of free market of ideas. They will lose this battle and they will lose this war because they have been wrong so often that it is becoming increasingly unsustainable. So I think we have much better information and knowledge on our hands generally than they do, and I think in this free market of ideas we can win. And so they have to essentially disrupt and skew and distort that playing field to essentially to cheat in order so that they can win and maintain their grip on things. But I think that eventually it does have to fall down. We cannot sustain this forever. Let's just hope that it's a matter of months and years and not one of decades.
well, I concur, and I'm so pleased you said that, Andrew, because it is a sign of weakness, if you will. It's a fact that they feel challenged, and whether it's resorting to narcissistic behaviors or more controlling behaviors, we know that this only occur. It doesn't in individuals. This doesn't happen in a healthy, balanced individual. It happens when there is vulnerabilities or insecurities at an individual level, and these vulnerabilities and insecurities are quite clearly playing out within these central authorities. And it is a defense mechanism. It is
Mm-hmm.
a clinging on to power. I think that the fact that there is a massive electoral cycle this year will be a potential turning point, although already we're seeing things. Almost every political cycle has now been smeared as far right, far right, far right, far right. It's. I mean, it's not to say that there aren't far right units progressing, but there is this constant smearing, knowing that this side of the argument is more likely to defend the great, wonderful deep state versus
Well,
the.
but I think it's actually helping
Oh, it is.
I think it's
Yeah, yeah.
enabling the far right I mean, this
Well, it
is
is.
because there is censorship,
Yeah.
and so people and there's increasingly fewer outlets, and I think they are enabling this. They're actually, it's a self-defeating approach, which sometimes again I don't know who is in charge. I feel like I could advise them better about what they would need to do to win. And one thing would just be to kind of take their knee off people's necks quite so much, and just actually you'll probably just get some of the people who are only moderately concerned about this really a lot less concerned, and just like just allow for a little bit more free speech and openness and go back to some of the old norms, and actually you won't have these big movements that rise up against you. So anyway, if the they are listening, that's my
Well,
advice
they
to
have been
you.
listening at some point in order to suppress all of my content, so that someone the 77th Brigaders, they know in the UK, I know that they've been tracking my content. They're recognizable. They think they're so smart. We can see you. But a couple of things on that point. You're absolutely right. So again, psychological studies around the vaccine narratives, for instance, the psychologists warned that if you become more extreme in your position and more authoritarian, that you're actually more likely to create distrust. So that has played out, because now more and more people distrust vaccines as a
Hmm.
whole. It's had the absolute opposite effect
Hmm.
of their intent. Um, and
Hmm.
and the similar is true in many other cases. And so it's there was
Hmm.
a second example I wanted to give you, but I've lost it. But it's related. It's related to the fact that actually the more, in fact, the more, this is the second point. Other studies have shown that in the presence of censorship, you actually proliferate more extreme ideas. It creates a counter response that actually enables more extreme ideas to flourish.
Hmm.
And you can look at this anyway. You know, Jonathan Haidt's work on the coddling of the American mind, talking about how they were, removing nuts from schools to prevent nut allergies. Yet when they did that, there was more nut allergies
Yeah,
because you're actually failing
exactly.
to expose people. So we need to expose people to a marketplace of ideas, including the crazy ones, and trust that we are adult enough to go and
Yeah.
just. But this is the point. So if you're watching this as an adult or a young person, how do you feel about a government deciding on your intelligence level and your ability to rationalize for yourself? I feel very uncomfortable that there's someone outside of me who thinks they know better. No, I don't know everything. I don't propose to know everything, but I want to have the authority over my own judgment, and I don't want that taken away from me. So if you align with that, then you need to
Hmm.
understand how important this is. My final question to you, Andrew, on this is an important one. We've talked about it. There are certain groups politicized. There are the elements of the society who are cheering on the big state, the deep state, as the New York Times, and there are groups you mentioned, the kind of progressives who have rallied kind of behind this behavior. How do we reach that group? How do we actually break through to have an open conversation about preserving the open market of ideas? Because we need as many allies as we can on this, and those critical groups carry a lot of
Hmm.
weight in the cultural domain right now. So it's important that we
Hmm.
find ways to break through. What do you think will take? What would it take to get that message across?
Well, I was hoping, and I don't know how this has panned out, that one of the silver linings of the war in Gaza might be that progressives, having now, I think, experienced certain amounts of censorship, see this problem. I don't know if that has happened. Some people I speak to are quite cynical and say they haven't kind of managed to map
No,
across to
I've
any
not seen
other
that. No,
um, um,
it's okay over
issues.
there, but not here. It's the
But
same. It's when it suits you, it doesn't suit you. That seems to be
yeah,
playing.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
compartmentalization. But I mean, I think there's a callback to other values. I think there's a huge amount of evidence of just how much the government got things wrong. I think curious and open conversations, um, you know, exploring ideas, definitely not preaching at, is the way to go. And in my world, I find lots of people on the edge of that space still who are there, kind of going, yeah, not really, but I can't see
Yeah.
anything because I'm going to get in trouble, etc. So there's a very authoritarian culture in those space, and there's a lot more people who have different things to say that are essentially biting their tongues. But I think there are more and more people who are getting more and more critical. There are more and more people saying, I've just got to step out of this very dysfunctional world. And I think a lot of the work I'm trying to do is kind of work with and organize with those kind of new politically homeless people, or
Yes,
those
yes.
people on the edge of the kind of liberal left progressive world who are open to have a conversation. I think the more you can kind of build a counterweight of kind of insiders or people who are now on the, or former insiders, to talk back to the people that they used to spend a lot of time with, I think the more you can influence. I think that a lot of what people try to do is say, well, there are those people over there. You try to other the people who are making the argument, which is why cancellation is so kind of fundamental to that culture. Is you've got to excommunicate the heretics, but eventually, if you gather enough heretics, I think you cannot be ignored. And so I think gather the heretics and have open and curious conversations with the true believers. Still, I think there is it's fundamental and necessary work. There's no other way. The winning the war for me is convincing the liberal left progressive space to recommit to free speech. It's not just defeating one side or the other outright.
I agree with you on that point. I totally agree with you on that point. But I think part of that as well is the kind of younger generations of today kind of associate with those groups more predominantly, I think. I think the other key to this is young people,
Mm-hmm.
understanding the value of free
Mm-hmm.
speech. We deal with young people who don't, they're not part of a generation like mine where like they can't imagine a world where people used to find dates without using Tinder. It's like we we used to go to bars and meet people. They can't imagine a world where the technology didn't play a role in physical interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
they don't understand as well the kind of world that we've lived in of a time of free speech and where that's so powerful. So it's important to make people realize what they've lost or what they're missing out on in a younger generation, because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately I think that's why there's been so many kind of Gen X and above baby boomers and it's basically people's grandparents trying to defend the freedoms of their children. So many grandparents I meet, and parents that watch our show, they always tell me, I say, why are you fighting for this? And they say, it's for my kids' generation. It's their future. But we're fighting for a generation that don't see the problem.
Even
Don't
if,
see the
even
problem.
if even if they don't want
Even if
it.
they don't want it, they don't see it. So I think there's work to be done there in terms of reaching the younger people, because I think like many social movements have shown us in the past, and this is partly where we could talk for hours about this latter point, because again, the weaponization of young people. There's reports saying that they're building kind of digital armies of young people in defense of the kind of ideals that we're rejecting here, this kind of big state and these kind of universal thought,
Mm-hmm.
yet they're being mobilized
Mm-hmm.
towards that end, and that's malicious. And but I think the moment they realize they're being captured, there's got to be a rebellion, but it's going to have to begin soon, because before it's too late. But I think the young people, the liberal progressive left, I agree with you. But then also the people who are long-standing advocates, who, like you say, on either side, the politically homeless, the center left, the center right, who are on the edges, but they haven't yet found their courage to have their voice. Let's face it, they can't fire all of us, So, the more
Mm-hmm.
people that take inspiration, you hear the Koldoffs getting fired. It's like, well, let's stand up. Be the person in the building next door
Yeah.
that says, I won't tolerate Martin getting fired. I don't agree with him, but so what? I will fight for his
Mm-hmm.
right to say what he believes is true. And I actually respect Martin as a scientist. We need those people to have
Yeah.
the courage to say, you know what, enough's enough. We've got to do this together. They can't fire all of us. And as a result, I'm taking a stand. So, Andrew, this has been a great conversation as always. Thank you for sharing your insights on the court case, and hopefully everyone here at home in the UK understands the importance of this. We're going to do further information. We're going to do further conversations on this topic. We're going to bring in some psychologists, behavioral scientists to help us understand why people have fallen to the spell. We're also going to look at the legal side in the United Kingdom, and we know we've got a European audience as well. So we're going to try and bring some international perspectives on what's happening here, because this has been playing out across the world, but this American piece is so strong because it can create a ripple effect around the world. So we have to keep a firm eye on what's happening there. And I can understand, Andrew, you saw the importance of this and flew out there, and credit to you for doing that. So thank you so much for reporting back to us here on the Free Humanity podcast. We must take a stand.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's so important. So to those of you watching at home, please share this episode. It's critical. It's vital that we hit those edges of the Overton window, those on the movable middle, or the politically homeless. Let's inspire a conversation. And hey, if you disagree with what we're saying, come and talk to us. That's the whole point. We want to engage. We want to have open dialogue in a respectful and meaningful way, and that's how we progress forward ultimately here in a free and open society. So, Andrew, thank you so much once again. Now, just to close out, you've launched a number of projects, you've been involved in some high-profile projects over the last few months. We talked about the Westminster Declaration prior to this episode. Is there anything you'd like to flag people's attention towards in terms of what you're doing right now and the wider work that you're involved in?
So, I mean, my main work at the moment is through an entity called LiberNet. It's a digital civil liberties initiative that I direct, and we're in a kind of building phase at the moment. We'll be coming up with a number of new initiatives soon, around issues of programmable currencies, censorship, surveillance, privacy, and the issues that we've been discussing here. And I write at network affects, I should say, at Substack. So do have a look at that, but there will be more coming soon. I'm basically working with people to build out a new team, specifically trying to reach some of those refugees, as sometimes they're referred to, because I think there is actually a lot of people who are not happy about this, but we're all not speaking up enough, as you just mentioned, Dan. So yeah, there is hope.
Refugees, I haven't heard that one. We call them lost left. I'm a lifelong politically homeless individual, so I straddle all of these worlds and don't feel at home in any of them. So I hopefully can relate to people on the left, the right, the up, the down, the blue, the reds, the yellows, the greens, or whatever team you play for.
Good heterodox. I'm all for heterodox these days.
Yeah, I mean, basically, none of it is ever. I just think the whole thing is broken, and it has been ever since I was a child. So we're fighting a losing battle, but that's a much deeper conversation around political transformation. But on that note, do check out the links in the bio here and the description. You'll see the links that Andrew's talked about there. And as we're at the end of the episode, you'll see a little, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see a little thing flash up where you can see Andrew's last conversation about the Westminster Declaration and find out more about our content. So do look that up and look out for our latest episodes here on the show. Hit subscribe, and we'll be right back with you very soon on our very next episode of the Free Humanity Podcast. Thank you very much once again, Andrew. Let's keep the mission on. Let's keep moving forward to a free and open world.